right, thank you so much, everybody, for sticking around and coming to our panel. We're going to be talking about server components, but from a community angle. My name is Shruti Kapoor. I'm a React 18 working group member. I am a front-end engineer at Slack, and I'm very excited to present this panel with some of our really cool people from the community, and I'm going to pass on the mic to Ben to introduce yourself.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Fred Schott, CEO of Astro. Just kidding. I'm actually Ben Holmes, a maintainer over at Astro that is the unofficial CEO of Whiteboards as well. Good to see y'all.
I'm Ryan Carniato. I'm the creator of SolidJS. I maintain open source, also Marko. Yeah, I guess I'll find out why I'm here.
I'm Tanner Linsley. I'm a co-founder of Nozzle and creator of TanStack. And yeah, I'm also trying to figure out why I'm here.
Okay, so server components, or React server components, have become really popular since 2020. There's been a lot of buzz around it. I've been very excited to learn about it. I've watched all the YouTube videos. I read the blogs. I still kind of don't understand. So that's why I'm here, to understand from you guys. But before we get started, I want to ask you guys again, raise your hand if you are excited about server components and using them. Yeah. Yeah.
Can we split that question into two?
Okay. Raise your hand if you feel you know what you need to use to have server components in your app.
All the content creators raise their hand. All right.
It's an overlap, yeah.
Okay, before we get started and talk deeply about server components, I want to take a minute to talk about how server components are different from server rendering. So Ben, here's a question for you. How are server components different from server rendering, and are they different from server rendering?
Yeah, I mean, they definitely are different in what they're able to do. Server rendering is what is kind of in the status quo, going into trying full stack frameworks like Next.js and pretty much all across every stack from Vue to Svelte to Solid, where things are kind of isomorphic, where you create something that is generally meant to be run on the client, and you also do a pass on the server in order to render out all the HTML that you want. So you send it to the client, they get a nice first load without any JavaScript, you see the HTML and CSS straight away, and then you sort of load that component again, hydrate it into place, and then you're able to use it. You don't have to do the hydration step to do server rendering. That's typically how it's done. And with server components, these are now things that genuinely do not ship an actual full client bundle that retraces it top to bottom. There are some actuallys in there, but generally a server component is something that is going to run all the logic on the server. You can literally just make a database call straight in the component, and you can plop it into what's being sent down the wire, not worried about leaking that server logic into your client bundle. So it creates this new dividing line to actually say which of these components are also going to run on the client, and if so, you can add a little directive in order to create a separate bundle for all of that stuff. So it's a way to really do server only.
I love that explanation. And I think it would also be very helpful to understand each of the libraries you guys are authoring and maybe one or two key features about it. So Ryan, maybe I'll start with you. Tell us a little bit about SolidJS and one or two key features.
SolidJS is a declarative reactive framework that doesn't use a virtual DOM. So I'd say one of the key features is something called signals. People may have heard of them, which is a reactive primitive that automates updates with other components. And in so, components run once. So you don't have to worry about stale closures and dependency arrays and use memo, use callback, use ref. Those just don't exist.
And Tanner,
Yeah, shout out to Signals. Let's go.
Wow. I have a library called TanStack Query that makes it so you don't have to write use effect.
Yeah.
I have a router. Apparently, I have a form library now.
Just read the shirt.
Right here. Yeah, I have a lot of small tools that I hope help the ecosystem out. And yeah, query and router, table, probably the three most popular ones. But yeah.
And Fred/Ben.
Just Ben. You can call me Ben. But yeah, Astro is an interesting one. It's been around for a couple years, and it's kind of like an OG look into the server-client divide, where you can create components that run on the server with an Astro syntax, and you're able to client hydrate any component framework, React, Vue, Svelte, Solid, Lit Element. There's integrations for all of them. So it's kind of this jack-of-all-trades way to do a server rendering approach, but it's all a multi-page app. It's all focused on content sites. It has a router that is kind of like the OG Next.js router. So if you're building those kinds of sites like marketing, blogs, e-commerce, documentation, Astro is a really good fit for that sort of thing.
Cool. And the way I understand is that server components has picked up a lot of buzz recently, but it's not a new pattern. So. Ben, I'll start with you and tell us a little bit about the history of server components, but also what do server components mean to you?
Yeah. Ooh, what do they mean to me?
What do they mean to you?
What do they mean? We're getting philosophical. So, wait, what was the first question?
What was the first question? Tell us a bit of history about server components.
History, that's what it was.
Get excited about the second one.
Yeah. I was focusing on the second one. But the history is an interesting one. I actually got the chance to chat with Dan, other creators in the React core team, just everyone really, to understand like where did this come from? Because I've heard about server components since like 2018, it feels like. We've always been building up to it like concurrent mode. I don't know when I heard about that, but I was in college at the time. But it was a winding road. What was that?
Concurrent mode was 2018. Server components
2018.
was 2020, yeah.
2020, okay. The historian.
Yes.
Waiting for him to talk about Marko. We will get there.
We will.
But,
Don't bring it
sorry,
up
I
yet.
stole the
Don't
thunder.
bring it up.
Shouldn't have done it. But I know it started from like, because Facebook was originally a more PHP stack. They actually had something called XHP, which was like a more fancy way of being able to start from a server rendered template and being able to render JavaScript components or sort of compartmentalize parts of UI and be able to ship those in separate bundles. And all of that was kind of, I mean, it's in the PHP world. It's definitely a different landscape. You're crossing a language boundary there from PHP to JavaScript. And then React came along and kind of just blew that pattern away, and we had server rendering, and everything was assumed to run on the client, and it owns your app bundle. So now coming back to server components, it's taking that old mantra that Facebook was kind of working on there, and it's pushing it into a full JavaScript context. So now you have server components written with JSX that can then turn into client components down the tree, also rendered with JSX. So it's a consistent way to write server logic and client logic all using JSX in tow. So it was a very like gradual sort of journey that was born out of what Facebook was doing for the past decade or so.
Yeah, Facebook is my view on server components might be a little bit more broader in the sense that when I talk about server components, I don't just talk about React. And while it's not necessarily the same thing, you can see a lot of these technologies over time leading to us to where we are today. So if you want any kind of validation on the fact of whether these are something you should look into or invest in, I definitely suggest you do. And that's because as you mentioned, XHP and Facebook's time doing this way back, the technology like Big Pipe in 2010, this ability to kind of like stream in the assets and do everything in this partial way. I worked at eBay for a bit, and this is where the Marko part comes in because you got to talk about that. We were very influenced by what Facebook was doing with Big Pipe, and similarly at Google, they were also influenced. Basically, these large companies had the same problems they had to solve. They saw the JavaScript bundle increase before anyone else did, and we're talking 2011. People didn't even realize the implications yet of what bringing all the JavaScript to the client would do. But what they did know is they had real businesses that had real performance needs. So they had to attack this problem. And in my mind, server components is kind of an evolution of this trend through do partial hydration. You might have heard things like islands. I get to actually introduce it here. At eBay, they introduced islands and out-of-order streaming sometime around, I think, 2013, 2014 time period. And that's how eBay.com works, and no one's heard of Marko, but it was a JavaScript framework that is open source. You can go literally download on NPM, that introduced this kind of technology approach, but to basically no one caring. I can't sugarcoat that at all. And over time, it took many years later, I'd say also around 2020, when we saw other frameworks kind of start picking up on this island or partial hydration story. Astro, Fresh, which is just the idea that you have these defined boundaries like Ben introduced before. But so in a sense, when you look at server components, a different way of looking at it, perhaps, is taking this idea of islands, these interactive components, and bringing back client-side routing. Because the one thing that every solution before React server components had in common was in order to benefit from this less JavaScript, you had to actually do full page reloads. Like it was a multi-page app. That was the trade-off. In order to know something couldn't get to the browser, well, it could never render in the browser, which meant client-side routing was out of the picture. So from that perspective, I know I'm getting a little long-winded here, a different perspective is server components is almost a return to our roots of just doing this MPA rendering, except we've added back the client-side routing.
Tanner, anything you want to add?
Yeah, can you repeat the question?
A bit of history about server components and what do they mean to you?
I don't know a lot of the history of server components, to be honest. Like all this is news to me, and it's great to get a history lesson, and I'm glad that I know where this stuff came from. And yeah, Marko did it first, right?
As with most things.
Right. No, for me, I look at server components from. I try to look at server components from more of a practical, pragmatic approach. And just right now, I'm really excited about them, and it's really interesting to see the technical implications of what it's going to unlock. The islands architecture with the SPA router, and when you get into situations that would suffer from these very specific types of performance issues, the fact that you can do this is just amazing that we've figured out how to do this at all, right? So honestly, hats off to anybody who's worked on any server component architecture, because it's crazy to put all these moving pieces together and to figure it out. But to me personally, right now they mostly just mean an excitement on the outlook of React. And honestly, any framework, including Solid or whoever else wants to implement them, I think they're exciting. But right here in this moment, it's difficult for me to reach out and say, yeah, I can take this server component hammer and see all these nails. I don't really see that right now. I don't see the nails. Right. But I'm excited because I know that as long as we keep working on the server component ecosystem and the architecture, and everybody, kind of like Theo's talk this morning, everybody kind of pitches in, not just in React, but across the entire ecosystem, that story's going to get better, and the nails are going to start popping up.
Yeah, love that.
So yeah.
That's actually a really good point. So I'm curious, how are you thinking about server components, and how are you thinking of adopting them within each of the libraries? And maybe Tanner, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I can start. The first place that server components really would have a significant impact on the stuff that I'm working on is I have a router. It's new, it's in beta, and I would have probably already have launched it. But server components are definitely making a splash, and the hype is real. Literally everything at this conference has had some overtone and undertone of server components. So I decided to kind of hold off and just kind of see what was going to happen. Is it going to be a really quick adoption? Is it going to be difficult to implement? And me personally, I've already run into a lot of challenges trying to just understand what I would need to do as a library author to absorb all of the features and the contracts and all the things that I need to provide a server component experience to my users. So there's a few hats for me to wear as I'm an excited user, but I'm also a library maintainer, and I'm really just chomping at the bit to kind of get my hands on the polished outcome of all the efforts that Next.js and the React team, they're working together trying to get server component architecture really, really good. And I hope that maybe out the other end, they can just kind of pop out this little checklist, that's like, hey, we figured it out, all of it, and this is exactly how you can do it, and we'll help you along the way. And I know that we have like the working group, and there's lots of people exploring on stream on how to do this kind of stuff. I really can't wait for all that just to come together and become something more actionable.
Okay. Oh yeah. Okay. Yeah, it seems interesting challenge because routing is like the backbone of our frameworks, and server components in this direction is definitely lent towards that question of like, do you need a framework to use React? And as a kind of independent, I can definitely see where that gets challenging because you're like, I have a router, do I need to be a framework? And if I'm a framework, do I need to support server components? So that's challenging. It's also challenging on the outside, right? Because as I said, I was working on a lot of these kind of optimizations, and then when I understood what server components were, they fit into my mental model of an extension of what we'd been seeing with islands. I knew immediately I wanted them, but it's been challenging. Last fall, before we released the beta of Solid Start, that's like in our ecosystem, like our next competitor, we decided to put together a demo where we had, basically we took something similar to Astro's Islands, mixed them with a client-side nested router, and then added mutations that did it in a single flight. I know I'm getting a little technical, and we basically came up with a kind of a server component prototype. We put under an experimental flag, and honestly, I was blown away. Like, it wasn't myself who did a lot of that work. It was people from our community, Ryan Turnquist and Nikhil Seraph. They put this demo together, and I opened the app, and I played with it for a moment, and I was like, yeah, this is a single-page app. You could not convince me otherwise. And then I opened the network tab, and I saw there was like no JavaScript there, and I was just like, what? I started doing like an adrenaline rush. Like whenever they came up with a new demo, I'd be like, okay, I'm not going to open the network tab. I'm just going to like test the app as much as I can, put it through all the paces, and then I'd be like, and this is because I'm a performance junkie, so like this is how I get my rush. It's like, oh, Lighthouse, So yeah, I'm very excited. The challenge I had is React's a big, powerful ecosystem with a lot of influence. I had to solve a lot of these tools. Like I was doing it before use client or use server was a thing. So we had to design other patterns. We played around with like, I don't know, calling functions with $signs on the end and like a bunch of other things, but effectively the same patterns in the end. And I think that's the biggest thing. It's challenging being a small player trying to figure out how to consolidate on APIs when you're going to get overridden by the larger player anyways. So like this is kind of consideration. I could release the thing, last fall and been like, look, we've got the full server component solution right here. But I got to, unfortunately where I'm sitting, I got to wait and see what Next does. So yeah, whenever the big announcement comes out, and well, I think it might be this week, we'll be ready.
Nice. Astro is definitely an interesting one with server components, since we already kind of have like the server component setup, where Astro files are the server-side logic and templating that you use, and then you can resume with client directives with all the islands that you want to insert. So when it comes to React server components, like first off, I think there's things that Astro can learn from React server components approach, specifically around like how they handle client-side routing, where like Astro's more in the sort of older wheelhouse of like treating things as multi-page apps, which is a really nice default. It leads to zero JavaScript and doesn't assume you want a router tied around everything that you're trying to serve on your website. Like if you're trying to serve an RSS feed, you don't need that included in your SPA. So it was a nice default, and we're trying to like look at how React Server Components treats client routing to see what could be done there, like with out-of-order streaming, which is how they approach the problem, which is sort of it's a novel way that they've actually set it up. So I'm interested to learn more about that. And also, like, whether React Server Components can just be supported in Astro directly. Since we already support React, it does make sense. If the React ecosystem grows around React Server Components, libraries are really built on the idea of like, yeah, we provide all these async first components that are designed to run on your server. At that point, like if we want the React community to really like thrive inside of Astro, it makes sense to also support React server components in some way, where you can start from an Astro page, insert React server component trees wherever you want, and you kind of get the best of all worlds there. So I think that part is more of a wait and see, and how it can be implemented inside of Vite, which is our bundler of choice and Solid's bundler of choice. And see where we can go. And yeah, we're all Vite lovers up
Yeah,
here.
Vite is
Yeah,
amazing.
we love Vite. Yeah, still waiting on Vite reaction. Yeah, shout out to Vite. Can we have some claps for Vite out there? Let's go. Yeah. Can we get some boos for Webpack? Okay, I won't do that. I'm not gonna do it.
We've made good progress there. You'll be happy to know.
Yeah, Nikhil.
Nikhil Saraf
He's
has been
working
working on a Vite RSC plugin, which has a lot of the functionality that we find in some of the frameworks. So I anticipate in the coming weeks we're going to see more projects in Vite. And also Daishi has been building a framework around React Server components. So there's a lot of really cool options starting to pop up.
Yeah, that's good to know.
So actually, that's a really good point, because I'm thinking as somebody who is using Astro in their app, as a developer who's using Astro in the app, when Astro does start using React Server components, not React Server components, server components, how does that change the code that I write as a developer who's using Astro? And same with TanStack, how are you even envisioning the code will change for the developer who's using the libraries?
Like how it would change if you were starting from like
let's say I have an Astro app or TanStack, and the library has adopted React Server components or server components. How does that change the code that I write? Or do you think it's going to be done behind the hood?
Because I feel like with Astro, it would mostly just be like interop with React Server component libraries and being able to use that, because Astro already has like the server-first model in order to insert islands.
Right.
So I feel like if you're using like the Astro syntax in that way, I feel like you'll continue using it that way, and then also plop in React Server components if you're porting them in from some other library or source. Also, like if you're an MDX author and you just want to like write your content, insert components wherever you want to, it might be convenient to go from like MDX to React Server components. That's something Astro does quite well right now, where we have like you can insert islands into MDX just like you do in Astro files. So being able to do that with React Server components would be cool as well. But the mental model of like server first is already kind of baked into how Astro does things.
Right.
So it'd really just be like a different flavor or template syntax for the same thing that you're trying to get out of it.
Right. Tanner, what do you envision?
I don't know, like I think we've seen what it looks like in Next, right? With their new app directory and their alpha production, I don't know which it is, server components feature in the app directory.
Right.
And it's cool to go in and see kind of how the code does change. It doesn't change too much from what you would expect. You see some async, some await sprinkled around, and of course, use client and use server.
Yeah.
There's not really a whole lot of other changes, but more just around the way that you can approach writing your applications. My hope is that and I'm a little more constrained than like Solid or Astro, because I'm not running on top of my own framework. I'm kind of locked into whatever React decides is the way it needs to work. But the hope is that it would look very similar to this experience that you have in like the app directory from Next, right? And obviously not the same conventions or opinions around application structure or routing or things like that. But at the core of it, you would essentially have the same capabilities: async, await, use client, use server, and then on top of that, maybe even some extra fun stuff. Like we've been working on Bling, which is kind of an experimental code extraction utility that we have talked about could potentially also satisfy the same contracts that server components need to function. So think of it as a potential alternative syntax to server components. And we'll see what comes out of that.
Cool. Ryan, anything you want to add?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting challenge. I keep on empathizing with Tanner's position here, because you've got these large, even, we talked about CSR apps, but even SSR apps, and now you're kind of like, okay, how do I move to this new world when it's the core of the paradigm that's flipped? Like before we were like, okay, everything runs on both sides, annotate what runs on the server. And now we're like, no. Most things run on the server, annotate what runs on both sides. This is an interesting migration, because the easiest thing is just like scorched earth, just throw away the old thing, make a new directory. But like it has to beg the question, like, is it possible to not do that? Like, is it possible to put both things together? Like, I want to solve that problem in general. I'm hoping there's a way we can work with React to solve that problem as well. It always takes the first step to kind of go out and go like prove something's doable. But I think we need to do a little bit more right now to get to where people are today. So, because I don't think it's necessarily I've seen people positioning server components as a complexity thing, and mechanically it's complex, but that complexity should not be pushed onto the end user, at least ideally, because what we are seeing here, in my opinion, is kind of a rebirth, a third generation where we started on the server with our MPA apps, then we went client side. Sure, we server rendered them, but they're still single page apps. Let's not kid ourselves. Now we are kind of in this new paradigm. This is a big change and a big step. So it's a very exciting one. How do we get people from point A to point B? That's what I want to see.
I just want to echo that like coming from the perspective of like maintaining a relatively large single page application that is fully client rendered, like going back to Jeff's talk that was just right up here, like I am the only client rendered dot on that chart. And for the exact reasons that he brought up, right? Just because of the nature of our product, like it doesn't make sense for us to be, in a server rendered environment. But that doesn't mean that there aren't features and things that we could do with a server rendered environment on, some specific places of our application that would be really fun and beneficial to our users. Yeah. It just means that a bulk of our application lives there. And, for me, looking at, okay, this move to server components, right now, I don't really see any other way other than kind of what Ryan said, where it just kind of scorched earth, like you got to just rewrite, right? And you have to approach it from the top down. It's a completely new paradigm. But like for a lot of, like I did this exercise at my last talk that I did, but raise your hand if you maintain an SPA. Okay. How many, keep your hand up if you server render that SPA. Okay. 2. There were a lot of hands up for just single, like just client-side SPAs. And you maintain a Next.js application. There you go. I just don't know the answer to your question. There you go. So I don't see a smooth migration experience where if we just kind of say, hey, there's all of these applications that are SPAs that are kind of like they're stuck there. They're not stuck there because that's what they're choosing. Yeah. It's because they're probably successful applications and they have customers and clients and users, and it's probably just a non-starter to say, you know what, here's this new paradigm, you got to start over. Yeah. That's just a non-starter for a lot of companies, and not because the developers would choose that, but because their superiors probably would never approve it, right? Yeah. I'm really interested in exploring this middle ground of like, is it possible to run an SPA, router and an RSC router in parallel, and maybe switch off between them and offer some type of migration story, yeah. Because that's where I'm at, and it's a non-starter for me. I'm not going to go rewrite Nozzle to use RSCs when like the benefits just don't make sense for me. But if there was that incremental migration path, I might consider trying it out and moving smaller pieces and eventually getting over that threshold.
Yeah. Ben, was there anything you wanted to add?
I mean, not really. I would definitely echo that, because I know at my last company, that was one of the spas that was not proudly a spa. There was a bit of lighthouse issues there where everything was client rendered, and well, they were kind of stuck on it because it was hard to migrate from one infrastructure to like a server rendered one or an opinionated meta framework. Like there are a lot of people who work just outside of that whole opinionated piece of it and just like spin their own React router, or literally using the React router library or TanStack or whatever, and just roll their own. And trying to get off of that into now a very new paradigm is a bit different. So part of me is fascinated with like server components like in core Vite or just something that's like not tied to meta framework opinions about routing in other pieces, and if that can ease that migration, like from full on like client rendered to full on server rendered.
Yeah, we're talking
but
about
that's
what
a role.
Nikhil is working on right now.
Yeah, exactly.
The wheels are in motion.
The wheels are in motion.
We're not just sitting here saying, "Wow, wouldn't it be great if there was a migration story?" You know, like
Yeah.
Stuff's
like
progressing.
we're trying. Like we have, you know, we've got irons in the fire trying to you know, if it's not going to be provided or talked about. I realize the Next team and the React team are very busy. I don't expect them to just show up with, you know, the migration story on a silver platter for us. So we're trying to, you know, be in control of our own destiny a little bit and just create that migration story.
So server components are part of the plan for your future.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Cool. Okay, so let's talk about why server components may not be a good fit for an app developer, and maybe some challenges of server components. And Ben, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I've definitely heard some interesting takes on like, is there an inflection point where server components, at some point, like so much is client rendered that it's like everything is one big use client island. It's come up in Astro before, possibly because there's more limitations around client routing in Astro that server components addresses. But I have seen like, you know, new libraries like TRPC that allow you to do calls from server client and back again. Those are definitely built around dynamic experiences that are client first. And server components are like a different way in order to bring that data into the client, and it's just a different pattern. That can be suitable to some apps and not others. I can't speak to specific ones because I don't build highly dynamic apps. I build mostly content sites. It's why I work at Astro. But I have seen from those kinds of library maintainers that is more of a thing. And also those that rely heavily on React context-based tools. That's like a big thing I'm seeing in the ecosystem where it's like, you know, your error monitors and your CMSs and all of your tools rely on React context bubbling things down from global state. And in server components, you don't have like a full client context wrapping everything. There are server contexts and other ideas floating around there, but it's a paradigm shift that might be worth it when libraries move over to those new patterns, but in the interim, it is sort of a challenge to like sort of move that needle from client context and global state and management over to server side. And you have to judge whether that wait time and that technical cost is worth it to your team.
Oh gosh.
Yeah.
Go, Tanner.
You know, I really just can fall back to like what I know, and really quickly, like I'll describe to you Nozzle, the project that I work on all day. It's 100% behind an authentication gate, so nobody uses it without logging in, and we use Firebase, and even though they came out with a new version, we're talking about at least 1 second to see anything at all. And once you get in there, yeah, we have, you know, admin sections, and it's a lot of, you know, REST and CRUD and managing data. But then the kind of big part of our application that gets used a lot is this big dashboard data exploration area. And like there is very few sections of this area that have less than, you know, 5 or 6 widgets or charts on the page or tables of some form. Yeah. And each one of those widgets is producing a unique query that is, you know, being sent off to our API that is then crawling, you know, terabytes of data out of BigQuery. And I'll go back and bring it all back in and show some data for you, right? And all that can all change just, you know, with a few clicks. The entire screen can just change. And thinking about how I would replicate this experience in React Server Components just sounds like a nightmare. Like I don't know how or why I would actually want to try and perform the same type of actions and get the same user experience that I have right now using server components. Now, that's not the same story for maybe some other places of our application, right? But those places are just very few and far between. But I realize that's because that's the nature of the application that I'm working on, right? Now, I realize that if you were, you know, if you're building an e-commerce solution, you're probably going to want amazing SEO. You're going to want things to be really fast. It's going to be heavily personalized, right? And you want to avoid all of the waterfalls that you can. That to me just seems like a really complex problem where maybe server components could really shine there. And maybe that makes sense why Next.js and Vercel, like, they're pursuing server components so heavily, because they probably have a lot of clients that have those problems, So I'm honestly just not the best person to ask about how server components can help you, because I don't have a product that I believe would benefit from them right now. But I plan on building more products in my lifetime, and I guarantee some of them are going to need these types of features.
Right.
Yeah, it's interesting because, like, when you look at the spectrum of apps, like the holotypes, and you can like lay them out, like you have very heavy content stuff on one side and then maybe Figma on the other side, and you can go through the spectrum. To me, server components represent the widest range we've ever had a single solution cover on that. Not necessarily saying that it can do everything, but it's for the first time, like classically something like React or a client-side framework was kind of in the middle, going over to the Figma side. Like you can build like really interactive apps with it, don't really bring it into e-commerce kind of thing. Now we're kind of getting to a point where like they've extended it out into that content area where it basically could be good in places that care about fast page loads. But I mean, there is still that question, like this paradigm, everything we've seen so far with it is kind of a return in the same way to the MPA mentality. Like it's a simplification. This is how you balance the complexity. When you update stuff, you do kind of mirror like form posts. It's kind of like a full page reload. That's the mentality behind it. If you have the idea is you could, by doing so, you can move a lot of the complexity out of the client. So now you don't need all that client-side state. We've seen this as a part of a progression over several years, right? We started from a place, and this came up in Theo's talk, where we're like, okay, here's React, and then you're like, how the hell do I manage state? And it's like, okay, we need something. Flux, Redux. Then it was like, okay. Then we got GraphQL, and then we realized that we could like literally do everything and coordinate it. And like even when it's far as something like Relay, and you're just like, wow, like to this day I just look at Relay as this thing of beauty that like everyone could aspire to. But the truth of the matter is there's a complexity there that was too hard for a lot of the average developers who weren't necessarily building these crazy apps. And as a framework like React gets more and more popular, it's going to be used in a wider range, right? So what ended up happening is we actually ended up realizing we didn't need as much state management if we did in data, and then we realized we didn't want to deal with the caches, so we just got like simpler, and we're like, okay, well, screw that normalized cache, let's just use React Query. And then we were like, okay, even to a certain degree, maybe React Query is too much, let's just use remix loaders. And we just kind of like, server components are almost at the end of that spectrum where we're just like, yeah, like just don't do anything on the client, Like, I mean, I wish things were that simple, but nothing here stops you from using this model as a base to build those complex client stuff. It's resetting that baseline. So it's compelling because like from a, I don't know what you call it, first principles, like from a theoretical standpoint, we can look at the solution and be like, yeah, this covers all the boxes. But it's always tricky because you might be better served to go to a solution that caters to you. So that's where the balance is going to be fit. Because right now we're just showing like, look, you can do all this, and this is a really simple case. So like it fits perfectly into those monolithic frameworks. But we still got this kind of divide between the classic client model and server components that we need to kind of get over this hump. It's like there's two Reacts. There's like the old React and this new React that's wrapping the old React.
Yeah.
That's a good way to put it.
I think one of my worries as somebody who's still on the old-ish React is, at least React 17, is like when React does become new and in my enterprise, like will my code break if React server components are introduced to the code base? So yeah, that's a question I'll pose for you guys is, will my existing tools and libraries work when server components are introduced? I'll start with Astro first.
Like, will they work when they're...
When server components are introduced to Astro, would my code still work? Not React code, Astro code.
Yes. I mean, yeah, like, I kind of, as I mentioned before, like it should work the same way.
Right.
And it's really just unlocking like a new sort of syntax in order to use those existing island patterns. So I feel like at least compared to the other two frameworks up here, Astro is like kind of the easier answer of like, we don't have to have users buy into a new mental model of thinking about things server versus client.
Right.
So it does make it easier to sort of step into that world if you want to. And React also has like some opinions around client routing and use transition in order to like, you know, choose which parts are going to refresh and having nice loading states. And the nice thing about Astro is it's kind of bring your own router, where we are working on like a client-side routing primitive in the next release, which is super exciting. But if you don't opt into that, you can just sort of make a wildcard route and say, all of these routes on my server, on my static build, whatever, are served by this React bundle. And it is a React server component, potentially, that's able to manage the router from there. And you can sort of say, sort of sanction off, like this is the React server component app in my Astro application, and then all these other routes are served by Astro files or Markdown or XML if you're making an RSS feed. Like it's very flexible in that way where you can like opt out of all the switches and just kind of use React server components as they're intended.
Yeah. No, I mean, I'm going to answer for both, I guess, React and Sol in this. I don't think it's going to break your existing code, but the challenge is the change in emphasis means that 50% of the existing ecosystem just doesn't matter anymore, which is a bold claim. But it's kind of true from my perspective. It can still exist, but to a much diminished means, which is a very interesting challenge because it means that, yeah, you can do what you're doing for as long as you're going to do it, but maybe people stop supporting it as much as they kind of move on to their different and new patterns. I think it's also very interesting for new players in here because one of the biggest benefits of using React is its ecosystem. If half of it, you know, so I think it's interesting. We're going to see where this goes. This is why Theo's talk is for us to kind of move into this next thing. It's going to take support of the community to build these new libraries that fit this paradigm.
Yeah, like if you can do it on the server and it's within reach and easy to do, like think about how much of the React ecosystem has been built around fetching data, right? So don't stop using React Query just yet. But it's true. Like they were just going to see more and more growth into, oh yeah, you can just do that on the server, right? But at least for now, the time being, like I don't think that things are going to break. You know, most of the time, all it takes is a well-placed to use client to make sure that things are going to keep operating normally. So I don't think that I don't think existing tools are necessarily just going to, you know, just totally bust and break right now. They need to keep working to get us through, or however many of us are going to be able to move over to using server components. They need to keep working through that transition period and into, you know, the next few years at the very least, right? Like I said, people aren't just going to be able to rewrite their applications overnight. So we're talking about a large process, years, right? I mean, think about how long it took for class components to seemingly go away and then...
or AngularJS.
Or Angular.
To Angular.
Oh!
Did I say that?
Or knockout.
So no, and that's how it's been designed, right? The React team it has always been really, really great about backwards compatibility, and the fact that they've been able to, you know, move on server components and introduce all this new stuff, and the only thing we have to do is like, oh, you got to put a use client in there sometimes. Like that's pretty dang good. We need to, you know, hats off to the React team because that's hard to do.
Yeah, I remember seeing a screen cap of like just taking a class-based component, putting use client, and just using it with like brand new React 18, and it works totally fine. So it's like, oh man. So if you're porting over something that's already like client-based or server rendered, like it can just kind of go in there, and server components are the layer on top that can like sort of, you know, import and wrap around it. As you were kind of mentioning, it's like new React on top of React.
Yeah.
It's pretty neat. I think we have time to take maybe 1 or 2 questions from the audience, if there are any questions. Ask us the spicy ones. Go for it. Yeah.
So we've talked a lot about the friction for the adoption here. I am curious how we could frame this, we touched on it a bit here, against previous adoption. Like, when we first used React, we had to do a rewrite anyways. Like, that's part of how this works. I think that hooks was a one-off in that sense, where hooks was one of the few times we didn't have to rewrite everything to get something. I'm curious, like, how big does the difference have to be for y'all to consider the rewrite, and how much do you think people are going to be moving in that direction in contrast to when we moved off of whatever we used before to React in the first place?
I think a lot of that has to do with frameworks, because, like, if you have, a small to medium or even a large app, like, and you're considering rewriting right now, like, the only choice you have is to use Next, right? And you want to use a framework. You want something that's going to hold your hand through the process, and you want the support and the ecosystem around that framework so that you feel safe in your decision, right? But right now, like, there are so many applications that don't, have the capability to move to a new framework, or let alone a new host, or even have a host, like a server at all, right? So I think, obviously, having more frameworks, having more options for developers to try them out without having to commit to so much in one go, I think that's probably going to play an important role.
Sure, but now React was a new frame, or should we just treat this like it's switching to a new framework?
Yeah.
React's replacing React so that something else doesn't.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I mean.
Yeah. If this is a completely new framework, then I mean, isn't this the point where people consider switching to other frameworks as well? Like, not okay.
I don't think.
Yeah.
I don't think it's as big of a move, but it is tricky because I find like it's easier for people to take an existing app. This is my experience with Solid, at least. It's easier for us to go like, okay, let's take our React app and put some Solid components in the leaves, so to speak, at the end. You're like, okay, I want to do this thing optimally. I'll just like put it at the bottom. Vue with Vue Vapor is actually taking this approach as well. You can use Vue, and then you can use their new compiler fancy thing like in the leaf nodes. But it's a bigger ask to swap out the root of your application. And I've been seeing some frameworks trying to like position like, look, you can use your React stuff inside our framework. That's a harder sell on the migration. I think that's the challenge here, is because with server components, that is exactly it. It's like you have to you can't just like incrementally adopt it the leaves. You actually have to like take the root out and then move the pieces in. To a certain degree, that's doable because you get to keep those pieces and then shrink them in size over time. But that direction is actually a much more longer, painful process than doing it the other way, where you attack it and then kind of go up. So I think that's where the challenge is. It's not quite as hard as completely switching frameworks, but
But almost.
But I mean, people are coming to me these days. I'm just.
I can tell you personally, like, it does feel like I would be moving to a new framework, because you are. It's a paradigm shift. There's syntax changes. There's new environments. There's new execution models. There's so much new stuff that it does feel like a new framework. And that's not a bad thing, right? Because at least it's a good spiritual successor to what we have, Angular. But like with Angular, I felt very lost when I was, in Angular 1X land, and Angular 2 is like kind of looming around for years. I didn't know what to do, and that's when I switched to React. Right. So it can either be a really great opportunity for React to say, hey, we know it's not, for the ecosystem to say, yeah, we know it's kind of a big process to move, but let's make it as easy as possible. I don't know what those tools are, but they need to exist, or like the pain could potentially drive people away from gaining the benefits, right?
Yeah. Ben, did you want to add something?
Yeah, I mean, I remember the original question was around at what point is the benefits worth the trade-off of it is, when you can compare struggles of would it be hard to move React to Svelte versus create React app to Next? I don't know. It depends on the app. It really depends on how much you would have to uproot, Like my last company, we were struggling to like go from create React app to a file-based routing system, mostly because the incremental adoption was so hard, because you're going from less opinions to a lot more opinions. And React Server components as they exist today, like they are built around like the app directory and other things as it exists right now. So like if the benefits aren't super strong, like you're building something highly dynamic and it's like, okay, I could uproot the routing system and do something completely different, might not be worth the trade-off. But if you're going from like almost no SEO presence and no server rendering to full server rendering, SEO managed for you, routes are actually easier for developers to understand, so the friction is worth it for onboarding junior devs, all these other reasons, then suddenly the trade-off is really worth it. And you can bring like your React design system along for the ride, which is usually something that might be weighing down larger systems. So like, yeah, it's really when you're in that pocket of like content stuff, e-commerce, and anything that really benefits from the server side.
Yeah. Cool. I think that's all the questions we can take. And because we are over time, I want to say thank you so much, folks, for joining us. Ryan, Karen, Hannah.